Hello, this is Miles Gray, and this is Pandoradom. Welcome, fellow Pandoranauts. Hope you're doing well and that these days find you genuinely surviving and thriving. These are difficult days, my friends. I don't even know quite how to characterize it. What I've been finding as a writer, as an artist in recent times, is that if you have a connection to Israel, or if you are Jewish, or in some way adjacent to those identities, places, states of being, then you genuinely and authentically face very serious threats, not only to your life and your livelihood, but to your very sense of self. Not only do you experience this as an Israeli, but also as a Jew in the diaspora. And furthermore, even if you're not Jewish, if you're what's called Jewish adjacent, or you're even simply not an anti-Semite, you are also victimized by this spreading scourge. Now, I often realize, or am forced to re-realize, that in essence, I and those of my generation were essentially born into a lull. Any serious student of anti-Semitism understands that it was doing quite well as a human sentiment for thousands of years in one iteration or another. Now, there are some historians who might argue the point about whether it was truly anti-Semitism as we understand it today in antiquity. I would argue that it is, or that it was. Uh, I mean, it was a more primitive form, and I also think that it was probably wrapped up in the general state policy of the empires involved, and it wasn't necessarily always completely specific to the Jews within their midst or within their empires. And yet, there seemed to be often a sort of special animosity reserved for the Jewish citizens. Now, it may have been that the Jewish citizens were unusually resistant to said policy. So that may have been one of the reasons why they were quicker to single Jews out within the empire. Now, we're talking about several different empires here. You could say you have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Roman Empire, you have the Hellenistic sphere of influence, various Persianate empires, various Muslim empires through the expansion of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula. It's uh, it's been a challenge. However, in any case, all of that, if it wasn't clear necessarily, or isn't clear what any of that was at the time, we can still say that it very much led to what we are seeing today, that it is not at all mysterious how what was occurring at that point evolved into what has come to be a completely irrational hatred in our what we call sinat hinam or sinat chinam, which literally means something like free hatred, but actually it means something more like completely irrational hatred or substanceless hatred. Um, I said free. I mean, it's when I say Hinam, what I mean is it doesn't necessarily mean free. Actually, it's when you say Hinam in modern Hebrew, Hinam does mean free, but in the sense of something being free in not costing money. So if you say, "How much does this cost?" and someone says, you would say, "Kama ze ole?" but the response might be, "Alo, ze behinam or ze bechinam," and that means that it's free of charge. However, in the phrase "sinat hinam," which means hatred of free, or free, it means free hatred actually. It's just the structure of Hebrew is different. Uh, so whereas in English you would say free hatred, in Hebrew you say hatred free. You understand? So similar to how it, for example, in French or other Romance languages, you would more typically put the adjective after the noun it modifies. So it is in Hebrew. However, in many Romance languages, you can go back and forth. So technically, in Italian or Spanish, for example, you typically would put the adjective after the noun it modifies, but you can also put it in front in many cases uh, for various purposes. In Hebrew, however, generally speaking, you have to put the adjective after the noun it modifies. If you put it in front of it, it doesn't it has a different meaning is as in essence. Because if you said, for example, it's worth giving you this small grammatical lesson, I have to say, probably, because it reflects a lot of what I talk about in other videos in terms of mindset. And I really believe that it can, language and linguistics can affect how you parse reality. This is, of course, a version of Sapir-Whorf theory, but um, I'm not necessarily saying it completely determines how you see things, but I think it does have an effect, especially if you're multilingual, which I'm actually doing a major study on right now. Um, I actually should be working on that dissertation. Instead of working on the dissertation on multilingual development and acquisition, but first it's actually what I'm working on is it's a paper on it's a dissert like a monograph on um, multilingual first language acquisition and development along the lines of three major research themes, which I have a lot of data for, which are uh, number one is language agents or linguistic agency. The next is bidirectional language socialization or reciprocal influence between siblings, especially, although not completely excluding what's called vertical oriented in language socialization by parents to children. And then finally, what's called family lect, which addresses the previous issue I just brought up. So that's what I'm writing a paper on. It's very long. There's a lot of data, a lot of different a lot of different documents. It's part of a general suite of research. So it's turned into something way bigger than I intended it originally to be, but such is the case often with me. So I kind of made my own grave because the thing is that I could I mean it started out as an assignment for a college course because I have returned to college to get my degree as a teacher, which I have worked as a teacher for decades. It's just that I didn't actually have the need for a full-on certificate, and now I do. So that's why I have gone back to school at the ripe old age of beep, 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 beep. Uh, that is not a very convincing, a very convincing uh, censorship bleep, but whatever. I think it's more like bleep. Maybe it's a Morse code cry for help. Well, actually, if you know Morse code, just saying beep 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 is not a cry for help. So I must be very, if it was meant to be that, I must be quite illiterate in Morse code. Anyway, I digress. So what I was trying to say is that if you were to say, for example, in Hebrew, the red apple, or I should say red apple, would be tapuach adom or tapuach adom. And what it literally means is apple red, and it means red apple. Now, if you were, now see, the thing is in Spanish, if you say red apple, to my memory, it would be manzana roja. Manzana roja, I believe, is that right? Manzana roja. Yeah, I believe so. And technically, you could, especially in poetry, you could say La Roja Manzana. It would be a little bit awkward, but you could maybe not. Like you could though in poetry, certainly. In some other contexts. It doesn't change. The point is that it doesn't change the fact that it functions fundamentally as an adjective that modifies the noun that it's adjacent to. However, in Hebrew, if you say tapuach adom or tapuach adom, apple red, if you then put the adom, which means red, in front of the noun apple, and you say adom tapuach, it doesn't, in this case, it's still an adjective, the red or adom, but it's not modifying the noun that it's adjacent to as an adjective normally would anymore because you've put it at the front. And what it would actually mean, if you were to write Adom Tapuach, it would in essence mean something like red is the apple, or the apple is red. So it'd be like a poetic way of saying Adom Hatapuach or Adom Tapuach. So it mean red is the apple, or red is an apple. Yeah, red is an apple is more correct. So that's an interesting thing because, of course, in Hebrew, there are many cases where the copula, especially in the present tense, is not necessary. That is to say, you can drop uh, the verb to be as you would normally use it in English, for example, where it's in standard English, it's for the most part um, obligatory that you can't really say in standard English, I human. You have to say I am a human. You have to say you are a person. You are a postal worker. He is a good guy. You have to put that copula verb in there. In Russian, you also do not put a copula in that case. So it would in standard Russian or standard Hebrew, when you say like I am a doctor, you would normally say what in English would be I doctor or I a doctor. I mean, you don't really have a word for in neither nor no neither in Hebrew nor in neither in Russian nor in Hebrew. It's understood from context. So it would basically mean I doctor. The difference, of course, is that Russian is a synthetic inflecting language. So you have special endings that show you what grammatical part the I and doctor play. Well, I is already clear, but doctor, it shows you what grammatical part it plays in the sentence. Hebrew does not have such endings. It's you sort of mark such relationships in a different way, primarily through the use of attached prepositions. Uh, so it's sort of like if you say the word to in English, like to the market, those are all separate words. You write them differently and you essentially pronounce them differently to the market. In Hebrew, to is usually le, and it gets attached directly to the word market. So market is, you could say shuk. So the shuk is more like a bazaar, but then in any case, you say to the market would be la shuk. And it's one word. Uh, in very high Hebrew, extremely biblical like Hebrew, you could also say hashuka or hashuka, which would mean like towards the market or to the market. That's already really, really high Hebrew. I mean, even a lot of modern speakers would not understand what you meant if you said ani holech ani holech hashuka. People would say, "What, ma?" But technically, it's a very beautiful Hebrew for saying such a thing. Normally, people would say "ani holech lashuk" or "ani holech lashuk." Technically, it should be. And also, you could say "shuk," but that's for much more traditional speakers. I mean, typically people say "shuk," but you could say "shuk" more traditionally. In any case, uh, I get into arguments with people about this all the time in Israel because typically people speak how they speak, but there is a very serious diglossic difference between everyday spoken Israeli Hebrew and a more traditional certain forms of literary or liturgical Hebrew. So different communities speak different forms. I mean, you have some traditional minorities in Israel who pronounce many of these Semitic letters in a very throaty way. That is to say, they maintain pharyngeality. So, for example, I myself too, uh, but more so because I'm an aficionado, I say things like ayin and het. So I don't say um achi. Achi means my brother, or similar to in English, like hey bro, or it can also mean your literal brother. So you'd say achi, it means my brother, but I say, as you hear, achi, achi, but many people say achi. So there you see that there's a achi is sort of a downgraded form, whereas ahi is the more traditional pronunciation. Meanwhile, you have another word like um what's a good example? Lo'azi. So lo'az or lo'azit, it means the language, foreign language, and is typically used to describe words that are not native Hebrew and that are based on foreign loans. It's called lo'azit, or foreign language. So, for example, if instead of using uh, the Hebrew term for a particular object, and I use the sort of international English type one. I'm trying to think of an example. Uh, hmm. Oh, I can't think of an example at the moment. Let's see. Uh, because the thing is, so many everyday objects already have native, sort of nativized Loazit derived form. So the everyday word for television is televisia, which is obviously derived from television, but there's not really a common alternative in native Hebrew. I mean, there are proposed ones, but and similarly for telephone. I mean, technically there is a form for telephone, which is called sah rachok or sah rachok, which is considered to be rather silly in modern Hebrew, and never was never seriously proposed by most accounts. Uh, and then there was another one. What was it? It was Rachzan? No, it was some weird one, some which I had almost never heard before. I can't think of it. What that doesn't make any sense though. Rachzan. That's like washing something. What was it? It was I can't think of what it was. It was some really colorful alternative. I can't think of it, but it was Ra something. I just can't think of what it was. Anyway, I think it was attested once or twice, but it never caught on from some time back. I'm trying to think of another example that would be, I mean, yeah, no, I'm really drawing a blank here. Uh, let's see. Oh, okay. Now, okay. So the international or Loazit form of the word van, okay, like a van that drives down the street. Normally, most people would probably say in Israel van, meaning van. However, there is a Hebrew term which is misharit. Excuse my pronunciation. I sometimes have a weird way of realizing my resh, but it's misharit, and it's that's how you properly say van. Now, many people know this term, others don't. Another example is tendil. Nah, that's not good because that's not really loazit in the same sense. Anyway, so the point is that I say loazit, but many people today would say loazit. So you hear, listen to the difference. Typical prestige colloquial Hebrew, you would hear a lot of, especially, a lot of people would say lolo, ze loazit. Properly, it should be zo loazit or zot loazit. But whatever, the point is, technically, you have this, technically, you have that. People have different ways of saying things. One is more colloquial or formal than the other. In my case, I say it not only with that very Semitic sound, but where I specifically pharyngealize the ayin, but I also maintain gender uniformity, linguistic gender uniformity. That is to say, I don't say ze loazit, I say zot loazit. Now, there are some cases where you should say ze, even if it's followed by a feminine. That's the thing. I'm not going to get into this. This is all very deep grammar. Not that deep, but I mean it's too deep for the purposes that we're of this video probably. The main thing that I wanted to get at, my friends, is that we're dealing with a scenario now where if you're Jewish, if you're Israeli, if you are Israeli Jewish Zionism adjacent in any perceivable way, or even in a way that is not particularly perceivable and yet has been perceived, you are in a very, very difficult position, my friend. Now, you have a choice, primarily two options. Number one, is you can give in and try to survive the storm, either by silence or by um either by silence or by general acquiescence. The other option, number two, is you can double down and fight back. I can't say which one you should choose. I understand that many people are in different positions, especially if it's professional and it's connected to your livelihood. It's very easy to say, double down, fight back. It's easy from my position, from where I am, from where I sit. But I understand there are Jews, Zionists, Jewish Zionist friends, and uh, adjacent persons abroad who don't have that same luxury. Because the sacrifice that I make is still ultimately supported by brackets that keep me from falling all the way down because I live in Israel. But there are others who find themselves in the United States or Canada or Australia, Iran, where being a Jew or being Jewish adjacent or even being Semitophiliac in any way, Semitophilic, I should say, in any way, is a social and possibly professional death sentence. Now, it depends on in what sphere or discipline or profession you work in, what your calling is. But simply focusing on the one that I'm most connected to, other than education, that is to say, literature and the arts, we're in a very, very problematic sea of worries, my friends, my dear Pandora knots. I would rather be thinking about space and colonizing the stars. And as I was telling friends recently, this has been one of the great saddenings of my life that for so long I felt myself to be a citizen of the world, that I was a denizen of the global spirit, that I was a citizen of the world, as I said. And I traveled all around the earth, largely by unicycle. It sounds crazy, but I literally did this in my youth. Um, I was a crazy kid. Well, teenager, very young man. I literally rode my unicycle thousands and thousands of kilometers through the East. That was amazing. I got into newspapers. I got into the Malaysian Chinese language Malaysian newspaper in Johor Bahru, right before you get to Singapore. They did an article about me. They interviewed me in Mandarin, and I told them, I was traveling on my unicycle. It's funny because I remembered the word for unicycle at the time when I was doing the interview, but I'm not sure. I'm sure. Oh wait, Lunchio. No. No, I think I know what it is. Anyway, it's been so long, I sometimes think about these things and I've lost a certain amount of my Mandarin. I can still speak general conversational Mandarin and read a little bit, but not as much as when I lived in China. I used to live and work in China. That was I've been all around the world and I've kind of lived temporarily in a lot of places like Nepal, India, um, Laos or Lao, Japan, South Korea, etc. But the places that I truly lived longer term, I lived in China, the PRC, for a number of years. I spent over 6 months altogether living and working in India and Nepal, which is not so much, but it's enough to get an idea. Uh, and and then I've lived in Israel for well, what has it been now? It's 2011, 2021. So yeah, about 15 years. And I lived in America, of course, from my birth up until about the age of 26, I believe. 25, 20 or 24, 24 or 26. I need to think about it. I was in my mid to early, like late mid to mid 20s when I finally moved abroad for good. And I had traveled a lot and then returned to America. I spent a fair amount of time in Mexico. I went to Mexico 4 times. These were all Now this is the thing. I wasn't going down there to like drink in what is that place called? What's that Mexican place that people always go to for spring break? I can't think of what that place is called. Oh my God. Heck, what's my problem here, man? I'm so out of the American mold now. I don't know even how current it is anymore, but when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, or maybe slightly before my time, I mean, there was like all the spring break bros and their girlfriends would go to. I'm completely drawing a blank. What the heck is this place? Starts with a C, I think. Uh, that my point is like it's so not on my radar that I can't even think of it. Uh, but in any case, I went to Mexico. I was in La Ciudad de México, de México, la Ciudad de Mexico, the LDF, the district, the Mexico City. I was in I obviously in Monterrey. I was well, not obviously. I was in Monterrey. I was in Guadalajara, I believe, Chihuahua. It's a lot of places. I was in down south in the state. I think it's a state of Quintana Roo, um, and also Yucatan and all of this. And I spent quite a bit of time essentially in like Subcomandante Marcos territory. And that was a whole sort of interest of mine at the time of the Zapatistas, which you know, I was curious about them anthropologically, is really what it was. It wasn't that I supported them or that I was anti. It was just that I was anthropologically curious. And that's the general characteristic of how I approach different cultures that I've lived amongst or passed by in my travels, that for the most part I was anthropologically curious, and in a quasi anthropological way I was documenting them within my own literature. And then they have come to influence my fiction as well, because I have sort of an anthropological approach to my fiction writing, uh, among other approaches. In any case, so then I was all over Guatemala. I had a so-called familia segunda in El Salvador, La Familia Maldonado, and they were not like I married another woman. I mean that I mean that it's a family that kind of took me in for a while. My mother had a connection to a Salvadoran coworker back in the States, and she asked him, my son has had some trouble in El Salvador. I was wondering if you had any friends or family back home who might be able to, let him sort of crash with them for a while until he gets back his bearings. And he was, out of the goodness of his soul, he connected me to his family and friends in a little tiny place called Ciudad Arce, a little tiny town, an amazing town in El Salvador, very rural place, truly incredible. I have these very strong memories of sitting on the dusty cement of Ciudad Arce and going with my friend Pelon. Pelon means very hairy, but actually he was bald. He was completely shaved headed, so it was an ironic name. And he used to take me all around town. We played guitar up on the high hilltop with his friend. Very dangerous place, of course, because I mean there was a very deeply bloody uh, barbarism that occurred in El Salvador prior to my visit. I mean, we're talking about the 80s. I mean, it was complete carnage. So they were very deeply scarred, and I was well aware of sort of the remnants of this kind of activity that were still present there. I mean, you also had a lot of, already by that time, certainly you had a lot of gang activity that made its way up into the United States as well. We know that some of that has been nipped, supposedly nipped in the bud. Now we'll see how it turns out. But while I was there, it was still quite current, the gang activity. And it was one of the most dangerous places you could possibly go at the time. And there were also biological dangers. That is to say that, there was dengue fever, there was malaria. You obviously have to be careful about that and other illnesses that you might get if you're not careful. Uh, I spent a fair amount of time in Panama, in Costa Rica. I was held at gunpoint in Costa Rica. That was crazy. That was crazy. That guy had like a seal hand. It was very interesting a night that was. Anyway, I luckily escaped and got down into Panama. Originally, I was going to cross the Darien Gap on foot, but then I decided to take a flight because I just didn't have enough time, unfortunately. I mean, you're very likely to lose your life, of course, looking back. Had I actually gone down through the Darien Gap, especially going towards Colombia, um, especially at that time. I mean, it was even more rootless then than it is today. And the likelihood of being unalived is, would have been extremely high. It's quite extremely high today as well. Very high. It's a major gamble on your vitality to enter the Darien Gap. Um, but I very seriously considered it. I was about this close to doing it. And I was in the area, definitely in the area. I remember. I remember. Yeah, and I look back, I mean, I could have gone down that road and entered the full jungle, and I was in the jungle, but I mean, like, to really enter the full, true, deep depths. But in the end, I took a flight to Colombia, a short one, and I avoided that. Now, on the other hand, I did enter the very depths of the Amazon jungle though later. So as my trip continued, I by bus and by foot and by other means, I made my way through Chavez era Venezuela, made my way through parts of Boa Vista in the north of Brazil or Brazil. I was in Guyana. That was a crazy story, what happened in Guyana. I went up through the jungle with Brazilian smugglers. I mean, it was that was crazy. I mean, that was an insane sort of mini story within the greater plot. Well, I mean, this really happened. It's not just a story and make it sound like it's just a story. Then I was in Suriname, which is, former Dutch colony. Very interesting place. I really liked Suriname a fair amount. It was a difficult place. It's many of these places are steeped in a colonial legacy that's really it's harsh. And it's funny because a lot, these are like former British colonies, Dutch colonies, and so forth. And then these are, many of the sort of woke personalities that are so harsh with their propaganda against colonizer Israel today are people whose colonial legacy is so out in the open if you know anything about his actual world history. So the Dutch, go to Amsterdam. It's one of the most anti-Semitic places you can find on earth. I'm sad to say, which is insane considering the Holocaust on the doorstep of Amsterdam just a few tens of years ago. And it's like you learn nothing, Amsterdam. I mean, truly, Netherlands, I have a message for you. It's, I love you guys. I love you. Absolutely, I do. I spent time in the Netherlands and my cousin went to school in Zwolle. I love you, but I have to tell you that what you're doing right now is unacceptable. See, that's what you say to us, but I'm telling you that what you believe is false. You believe in a bizarro version of Israel that doesn't exist. It exists only in your imagination because what you see is, well, it's a Dutch word, apartheid. That's the English pronunciation. We don't have apartheid in Israel. It's a lie. Come here and you will see for yourself. It doesn't exist. Another one is Gen Zero side. Also does not exist here. It is a horrific inversion because that, of course, is what was intended to be visited upon Israelis and righteous Gentiles living in the Jewish midst, and which was perpetrated by Hamas and their ilk, including the PIJ. And unfortunately, many everyday citizens who were also involved. It's a very problematic situation because that was genocidal in intent and was meant to be part of a much bigger attack, which did not happen simultaneously as hoped by the Axis, and happened in a more staggered way, which made it easier to defend against, even though it was still very hard to defend against. Um, in essence, it was in by intent genocidal. Now, the Israeli response was essentially defensive, but it has been inverted by anti-Israel and anti-Semitic uh, agitators, including the UN, which is a horrendous miscarriage of justice qua institution at this point. They say such things, Amnesty International. These are supposed to be institutions that stand for human rights, but ultimately they work via lawfare to demonize the one Jewish state, or that is to say, a democracy with Jewish characteristics is really more properly how you would describe Israel currently. Because it awards or provides by right rights not only to its Jewish citizens, despite what you hear. It's just exhausting. I mean, it doesn't mean it's a perfect place where everything is hunky dory, but it is but at the end of the day, if you need, I mean, you need to understand that it's a robust democracy that provides rights not only for its Jewish citizens, but also for its non-Jewish citizens, which I like to call righteous Gentiles. Not all are righteous Gentiles, unfortunately. Some are not righteous Gentiles and agitate for destruction from within, unfortunately. But I would hope that most are essentially patriots. I've gone way, way off, but I think it kind of ties back in to what I was trying to say originally, that if you are a Jew, if you're Israeli, if you are in any way Zionist or Zion adjacent, you are in difficult times, my friends, whether you live in Israel or abroad. You face your personal friends disavowing you, ghosting you, turning you into an object of their rabid anti-Semitism. This has happened to me personally and to many of my friends and associates and fellow citizens in Israel, which many of you may say you deserve based on the propaganda of what our Israeli actions supposedly are. Unfortunately, you often hear, oh, it's a response to Israeli actions. I'll tell you something. You don't even know what Israeli actions even are, because as they're reported by the legacy media in the United States and in Europe, and certainly by elements like Al Jazeera from Qatar, it's ranges from outright lies to completely revisionistic um, exaggerations. Exaggeration is not quite the right word. It's more like it's just revisionisms of the truth, because sometimes it's based in something that actually happened, you know. Like there are cases where there really was a war, or there really was some sort of martial um some martial op, but to characterize it as a purposeful massacre, for example, which is so commonly done, is bad faith to the max. And it's generally agenda driven, but the problem is that the people who don't know any better, the consumer or the reader, they don't know any better. And this is what they absorb and this is what they internalize. And so it becomes part of their ingrained opinion, sort of like when they even hear the word Israel or Zionist, that's what they associate it with now, with what is essentially propaganda. So we're in a very difficult territory now because of this. What are you supposed to do? Even if you don't write about anything that has to do with any of this, but you're just a writer that you want to write poetry or epics, or you want to write fiction or nonfiction, academic work, whatever it may be. What's to become of you if you have publishers that are boycotting you because of who you are, or rather, whom they perceive you to be? When you skip literary conventions because you fear for your personal safety, because you know that there's a high likelihood that you'll be physically attacked because of who you are, or because of whom you are perceived to be, that you're even concerned about traveling abroad. Now, I will tell you this though, even with these considerations, Israelis and Jews and adjacent persons do not stop. That boycotting will not work. So even though I express that it's difficult and that it makes people double, to question, their plans at times, it doesn't mean that we're stopping. We don't stop. We do not stop. So ultimately, people who want to isolate us, they're not going to succeed. We will do everything in our power to make certain that that is the case. But again, returning just to the station of an individual writer, what are you supposed to do in a situation like that? I often wonder about this. If you had a Somali poet in Somalia, like how likely would it be that this Somali poet would be boycotted for who he or she is, or they is, because of where they are and whom they are perceived to be? Now, yeah, there are cases absolutely of racism or anti-Somaliism, I'm sure, but it is certainly not as systemic and as across the board ingrained and almost automatic in many parts of the literary world today with regard to Jews and Israelis and what are generally now called Zionists among anti-Zionists. I do wonder about that. And it's also very curious to me because I have to tell you that there is a pretty tiny possibility that Somalia today any publisher in Somalia would be interested in publishing original Hebrew poetry in Somali translation in Mogadishu. And I mean, you could say, okay, but that's also it's a marketing question. But no, even if there were significant marketing value in doing so, unfortunately, probably due to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as is rampant in Somalia, they would not do it. However, I must say, as I was trying to get at, in Israel, you absolutely would translate Somali poetry into Hebrew and then market it quite I mean, widely. Like it would be on the bookshelves in a lot of stores in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. People would buy it. I mean, like it would be like a small group of literary connoisseurs probably, but people would buy it. I mean, I've seen it. I mean, we have a lot of translated poetry into Hebrew from Iranian poets. I have a very good, friend or literary colleague who falls into that category. Um, and that's what's fascinating. Like you even find essentially anti-Israel poetry translated into Hebrew in bookstores in Israel. I mean, that's the kind of place where we live. It's completely, utterly different than what people perceive. Like if you can live in a society where you have anti-Israel books in Hebrew on the bookshelf and still exist as a society, it's pretty miraculous. And it's certainly a very different place than people imagine. They think of it as this unified, dictatorial, autocratic, uh, um, fascist state. And it's not at all what it is. I mean, I can walk out the front door and show you right now that Israel is not 1984. It's more free here than it is in America, for God's sakes. It is for God's sake. God's sakes, for God's sake, for God's sakes, for God's sake. I can't, I'm losing my English. For God's sakes, for God's sake. God, I can't even think of what the right one. I don't even know if you're a native English speaker or a highly fluent English speaker, whether you actually can say with certainty off the top of your head which one it is. You have to look it up. Now, it could probably be both. I think that probably one is the more accepted and the one other is the more colloquial variation. I actually think I do know the answer. I'm just being a bit facetious. In any case, that's what I'm trying to say. I don't know what the solution is. What I have seen is that there's a tendency towards recreating publishing scenarios, or I should say setups, where you suddenly have Jewish newspapers again. You suddenly have Jewish magazines or Jewish publications, Jewish publishing houses. This was a pretty common thing in the past when Jews had no other recourse than to do that in, earlier times in America, for example, where there was a pretty significant uh, proliferation of Yiddish and even literary Hebrew newspapers back in, the 40s, the 30s, and back into the late 1800s. Well, even maybe earlier than that, technically, you had poets that were writing in Hebrew in America. This is one of the lost histories. It's incredible. They were literally Hebrew language poets who they were generally immigrants from what's now Lithuania and Poland. They they came to America, Jewish persons who wrote in Hebrew epics about the African American experience in America, about Native Americans and cowboys, about there's even one on the gold, there's a sort of an epic on the gold rush called Zahav in Hebrew. Zahav means gold in Hebrew. So I have it. I actually have it. It's quite a rare edition today, or quite a rare book, I mean. Well, it's a rare edition and book. It's sad that it's not more widely known. I mean, I hope that someday there will be a resurgence in interest in this chapter in history. But Alan Mintz, I think it is. I think I have his book too on the shelf here, wrote a history about some of these authors. Now, the more significant in terms of numbers were probably among the Jewish writers of the time were writing in Yiddish, of course. So there was a lot of Yiddish literature, but the thing is that it kind of faded away, and now that's been relegated to like truly lost history in a much wider sense. Because I mean, the people who are really reading Yiddish literature is probably more limited at this point, whereas it was the dominant form at the time. However, the Hebrew one, which was much more specialized and written by a minority of Jewish writers in America at the time, that is arguably what survived, because now you have, a lot of those Hebrew writers, they were essentially writing about Americana of the era. It's not the Americana of the 50s, but like Americana of earlier pioneer America, or at least the spirit of the pioneer was still greatly recognized, or in the consciousness of the everyday person in a way. It was exported essentially back to Israel. That was the idea, or it was exported to Israel or to what was the British Mandate of Palestine. Um, Again, doesn't mean that it was called Palestine. I mean, it was a British mandate that they called Palestine. Um, even though the very word Palestine is from most likely from Plishtim, which is a Hebrew word, or you could say that Palash is a Canaanitico Hebraic. In any case, it's a Northwest Semitic root. So it's very strange that you have what in essence can be reduced to a Hebrew word, in a way that, it's basically a Jewish word. It's not a Jewish word, but it's like, it's very much wrapped up within this region. So it's actually an appropriated word, um, in describing what it describes today. Because honestly, if you go back to the time of the British Mandate of Palestine, what a Palestinian actually meant, it also referred to Jews as well. So Golda Meir and other people, anybody who was here at that time, whether you were a Jewish subject, a Muslim subject, a Christian subject, or any other, you were a Palestinian within the mandate. It even said on the passports of Jewish persons living in the British Mandate of Palestine, nationality Palestinian. So it's like, well, but the meaning changed. So it was appropriated essentially by Arafat and others, around the 60s, and it came to refer to cultural Arabs that live in and around the land of Israel within the Levant, or their descendants abroad. So that is what it refers to today typically, but it's a very recent revisionism of its original meaning. And in any case, the word Israel or Yisrael far precedes that terminology and was used alongside it by Jewish people for whom Israel is the ancestral and indigenous homeland. And furthermore, the Jewish people are the oldest extant people that has a demonstrable connection to the land of Israel. Doesn't mean that people who are not Jewish are not allowed to live here. That's not what I'm saying. And that's not what Zionism is saying either, by the way. What it is saying is that Jewish people are, should have self-determination within the land of Israel, within this a state of Israel. But if you're if you're Gail Tzedek, or if you're a righteous Gentile that does not wish harm and you want to be a citizen, you can have equal rights. But it means not radicalizing and trying to harm others. Now that goes for Jewish people here as well. But the problem is that when you need to defend yourself, this is an endless process of being attacked and having to defend yourself. Now that's what they say about the other side as well. But anybody who lives here knows the truth. Most people do anyway, not everybody, but you have a few crazies who don't know they're behind from their elbow. But most people, even if they didn't want to believe it, they have to admit that it's the case after October 7th. I mean, you can't really get around it at this point. Like you can't have your head in the sand about it much longer. I mean, it was, there was some of the most prominent victims of October 7th were basically peace-loving Ruhniqim who, uh, believed in complete, unity between the two peoples, and they were the first to be delived. So brutally. So I mean, what do you do? So on the one hand, you're dealing with unaliving. On the other hand, you're dealing with being boycotted from literary conventions, from possible publishers, from being accepted and circulated within vaster readerships. It's a difficult time. It's a truly difficult time. On the other hand, you could say, okay, but it's actually a marketable thing because now you can say you face that adversity. So, in a way, it's like I look back at Allen Ginsberg and he was so attacked for how because of the how supposedly unacceptable and how how what's what I'm looking for here, like for being so vile and so explicit, I guess, that it requires an advisory, parent advisory sticker, like those CDs from at Best Buy when we were kids, that everybody wanted to buy just because they had curse words in them. Uh, but what I mean is, it wasn't actually vile. I mean, this was how it was perceived by its detractors at the time. So you have people like Allen Ginsberg, Diane de Prima, people at the time in the Beat movement were being attacked for being supposedly, corrupting the youth, I think is the idea, sort of what happened to Socrates. That's a funny comparison, but it kind of works. Anyway, so you had Diane de Prima, Allen Ginsberg, and others who were, being attacked by the establishment where they were having their books banned and so forth because of the or attempts to ban because it was considered to be very inappropriate writing. Now, on the one hand, I mean, you're getting into like some territory where maybe some concerns are justified when you're talking about like, there were certain things with regard to, I don't know if I'm allowed to say stuff like this on YouTube, but like, Vietnam blah, if you can understand what I mean by that. Stuff like that was, I can understand why, you know, but if, where, because you don't like victimization of non-adults is a serious problem. So aside from that, though, when you're getting into other aspects of, homoerotic poetry and so forth is not an issue. Or should, I mean, you would say shouldn't have to be, but obviously it was at the time. But what I'm trying to say is that for both Diane de Prima and for Allen Ginsberg and many others, this initial like 50s style censorship, denunciation worked to their historical advantage later because now, well, at the time as well, where now, okay, now people want to read it because they're trying to ban it. People want to read the limited. They want to read the the forbidden fruit. So from that point of view, I sometimes wonder, okay, so I have to accept the reality that I'm a hated, you know, right persona non grata within the literary world, not merely as a person who's writing in Hebrew, but as a Jewish writer who even writing in English or Arabic or any other language I write in. And yet it may come to pass against all of our detractors that you're in fact so hated, even if it's irrational and based on false narratives, that it somehow works to your marketing advantage later, where they'll say, look at these people who through adversity continued to write. They were hated by so many, and yet they came out on top. Now, I have to also address, though, this thing about hated by so many, because I would say that a lot of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic actors today, bad actors today, frequently say this. They say things like, everybody hates you. I've been told this actually myself numerous times by old friends who turned against me, uh, and by, many other voices that are not so, not people that I knew personally. But they say, but this is essentially a kind of gaslighting because the truth is that Israel has a lot of people, Israelis and Jews, Zionists, all have many, many allies and friends across the globe. And it's far more than these people who claim otherwise would have you believe. You hear this as a common refrain. It's a chant, really. Everybody hates you. Nobody likes you. Sounds like what bullies say in the schoolyard, actually. It sounds quite a bit like that, doesn't it? Nobody likes you. Everybody hates you. That's what I hear when people say that. And they literally say the same exact formula. Nobody likes you, everybody hates you. I mean, in fact, the vice president said a similar thing recently towards the Israeli prime minister in Israel. Like, whatever your feelings are, to say that to the prime minister of a democratic state, regardless, is profoundly unbelievable to have the gall to say something like that. It's because and it's not even true. That's the other problem is because it goes into anti-Semitic territory. When you're telling Jews nobody likes you, especially when it's demonstrably not true, it sounds quite a bit like medieval canards and blood libels. I mean, it's getting into that. And then you have actual blood libels, which I won't even get into right this second. But this is what we're dealing with. On the one end, you have outright obvious anti-Semitism. On the other hand, you have this nebulous, not so clear, highly diplomatic in the language of human rights based anti-Semitism, which people don't even identify as such, even though it quite obviously, provably is definitionally. People say, well, it depends on what your definition is, but be that as it may, it is provable within that framework. Whereas many of the detractions, probably most of the detractions, are not even provable within their own frameworks. That's the thing. So what do you do as a writer, as an artist, as a creator within a situation of such extreme adversity as this? What do you do, my dear Pandora knots? What do you do? Well, I tell you that from my angle, from my perch, from my eyrie, what you do is you continue to do the do, which is to write to what I call Thoth. That is like the Egyptian deity Thoth. You write, you pick up that hulmus, what is it? You pick up that quill, you dip it in your ink in the diota, in the inkwell, and you commit it to papyrus. You continue to write, you continue to Thoth, you continue to lay bare the very vellum upon which is written your meaning of life to say to the world from your heart. Commit it, write it, record it, Thoth it in the face of all adversity. Thank you very much. This has been Pandoradom. I am your host, Miles Gray.